Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be doing our final segment on building a quiz-based framework for vMix using Node.js. But before we get to that, I would, as always, welcome everybody. If you have any comments, have any questions, just post them in the comments section below where you're watching, and we'll answer them right here on air. Also, if you would like to join us live on the show, we have a link in the show notes right at the top for you to click on and become part of the show here. So we'd love to have you. Don't be shy. Okay, so what I want to cover in this show is really the last component in the entire framework that we've been describing to date. So in the first two shows, we covered everything for dealing with audience responses and how you take that from like a hash A, hash C, whatever, to correlate those responses. We did everything for showing questions, so having a file with all different questions, possible responses, what the correct answer is, all of that, and bringing that in and displaying that for your audience. So we have those two pieces, showing questions and taking responses. So for this show, we're going to focus on tallying those responses. So now that we have people responding, who got the question correct, what was the value of the question, and then adding that into a running score tally that we can keep throughout a series of questions and displaying a top 10 list of who has the highest scores at this point. So we're going to cover all that in this show. So I'll start by showing that to you, but before I do that, let me get over to the comments that we have here. We have a couple of people jumping in. So let's see. So we have America Newscape. Thank you. I've been anticipating this for a few weeks now. So thank you for hanging in there with me as we tried to get everything back. So we had John Simon. Glad you're back on your feet. John, thank you. I had a lot of well wishes health-wise, and I definitely appreciate that. That's always nice to have. We have Peter from Berlin. Peter, thank you, and welcome back to the show. We have Tom Willis from Alabama, USA. Tom, thanks for joining us here. We have Kyle Gunderman. So Kyle, hello back to you. Thank you. And we have JP Nade. JP, hi. Good to see you again here. So we're looking forward to this show as well. So let's get started by showing you how this actually looks now. So I'm going to take a 3-shot where I show my Stream Deck and the output from vMix, and we'll sort of go through this as let me straighten that up a bit, for everything that we've done in the past. So as I mentioned in previous shows, so it's sort of just a slight recap, I can select my questions here, and I can select the state that I want to process, whether I'm asking questions, waiting for responses, displaying results. And I have different titles that I can put up dynamically if I want to. So the way we normally start is I press a button. I have the first question selected already, so I display the question to everybody. Then I can go and say, okay, I'm ready to allow people to respond to this now. So when I press that in, everybody that is responding will start to show up as we move across this. And if you remember, this would normally be coming from vMix Social, and it would be updating one of the social title templates that are available. And from that social template, we'd be pulling the values. In this case, because we're doing this for demonstration purposes, we end up just feeding that title dynamically through sort of another little app we have running. So that at least gives us responses with all different things. So when we're done with this, I can say, let's close the responses. I don't want to allow any more responses. And we can come back and say, well, let's see what everybody did. And this is all stuff that we had before. So I'm going to show the results here. And so this is laying out the responses that everybody gave. So one of the things that we added now, since we're getting ready to sort of do scores and tallying, is I now have a button here which says show the check. So which group of people got the correct answer? So when I press that, It'll now come and say, oh, everybody that answered hashtag B got the correct answer. And so that's sort of that next step that we added. And then finally, if you'll notice up here, I have a top 10 button. So what this will do is it will take and load in the scores for everybody, sort it, and display the top 10 people scores that we have in this. So this is basically what we're going to cover here on today's show. And I'm going to really just try to dive into some of the things that we did that are different. And, hopefully, it'll just make sense when combined with previous shows. So let me start first by, let me look over here. And let's look at one of the changes we made to questions. So we'll start here. So one of the things we did before, we just had the question, the possible responses, and what the correct answer was. But one of the things I realized as we were doing this is that some questions could be harder than others. You may have questions that come in rounds. So each round of questions, the scores could go up. So we actually set this up so you could assign a value, a point value to the question. So people who get that question right will get that many points. And so that was one of the things that we added to this to sort of make it more realistic to the way people would use this. So the other thing that is probably worth going over is how are we keeping these scores? What does it look like? So all of these things that we're storing and manipulating are all JSON objects. So because it's Node.js, JSON is really like native to that. It's all JavaScript. And so it's very easy to manipulate these objects. So, excuse me, if we look, this is how we're structuring the score. And there's a few things to keep in mind. So what we are doing is we are using, and you'll notice this, we're using the URL of the image as a unique identifier for each guest. And this is, unfortunately, there is no real unique identifier handed back from any of the social platforms that we have. So in order to make sure that we can tie a response to a specific guest, we were looking for things that may come back that, while not designed necessarily as a unique identifier, are unique by nature. And one of the things we found is that would be the URL of the image for that guest, or, their little avatar image. And so we are using that as our key for everybody that submits a response to a question and gets a score. So in this, we are just basically using that key and saying, what's their name, what's their image, and what's their current score. So we just go through this, and as people continue to answer questions, their score in this JSON object gets updated. And we keep the JSON object in memory and manipulate it, but we also write it out so that if we want to go from one round to another round, or we stop the application, all that information is preserved in the file. And so when we start it up, we read that file and sort of load that as our baseline of scores, and we go from there. So let's see, do we have... So the next thing I'm going to do is talk about some of the functions that we've added in this. So the first thing that we actually changed in here was, because we want to save this file, in the general functions, let me go over here, we added a write file function. And if you remember, one of the things we did in part 2 of this series is we started to take functionality and break it up into different modules, basically different libraries that we then can export and import to make it easier to organize the code that we're using for this. So this is another one. It's a general function. We set it up, and it's very straightforward. We just basically take in, where do you want to write the file, and what's the data object you want to write to it. So like I said, very, very straightforward. And all we're doing here is, if the file path is good, if it's bad, we just set an error and return null. If it's good, we use, from the file system library, we do a write file with file path and data object. That's very, very straightforward. And we return that. But like from before, one of the things we need to do now is we need to export this. So that's the module exports write file as write file. So that allows us now to share this when we have other JavaScript components. We can now combine them by just importing these, and we're saying they're required for what we're doing. So the other place which we had things in was vMix handler. So these are things that are working more specifically with vMix here. And for this, we had two new functions that we did. So the first one was to update leaderboard. So let me see if I'm here. Yep. So what update leaderboard does is it takes the values that we had in that score file. So if you remember when I showed the score file, that layout, we take and read that in, and we go through, sort it, and feed a title with the sorted scores for those top 10 scores in the leaderboard. And so, again, very straightforward. We're taking the vMix URI, which allows us to write to the titles. We take the input number that title exists at inside of vMix, and we take the score data, which is basically the JSON object that you saw before. That's our score data object. We bring that in, and then we're just going through the top 10 scores. You could do a lot more complex things in here if you wanted to sort of create pages of ranks and split things up. We just wanted to take something simple for demonstration purposes. So we're just going through the top 10. And so we have a loop, and we are very simply reading out, setting up the URL that we need for the vMix function. So it's the web API in vMix. So we set the title, select the name of the object in the title. So we have everything from place, from rank 1 to 10, to the values for. Let me just wrap this around so we can see this. So the text values we're going to place in there, and we're just doing this for the place, we're doing this for the name of the person, we're doing this for their score, and we're doing this for their image. So when you saw that leaderboard pop out, those are the four things we had on each thing: their place, their score, their image, and their name. And so that's what you saw on that slide out from the right-hand side of the screen. And so with that was the first thing we added to here. Let me see. And the other thing is we added something to show the correct, it says show correct check. So let me just pop to that here. I believe that's in the vMix stuff. Yes, so right here. So in what show correct check does is it says, let's find the right answer, and we want to be able to put a check mark next to it. So how did we do that? So this is when we set up the title, which showed all the responses going across for everybody who's hash A up to hash D. What we did is we had over each one of those letters in the front, the hash letter, we had a little image of a checkbox, and we turned those all off. And so in doing this, all we're doing is we're saying, let's find the correct answer, and we send the vMix URI and input again, just so we can access that title. And for whichever is the correct answer, we actually will just go and turn that checkbox on so it becomes visible. And then when we reset it, we just turn those all off. So all the checkboxes, whether they were on or off, get set to off, and they disappear. So it's sort of a very simple way to do these types of dynamic things, but that gives us a very easy way to do this now. So all we're doing here is we say, let's find what the correct answer was, and we have each checkbox named. So it's like check A, check B, check C, check D. So we just pull the hashtag off of it. That's all this replace does. It says anywhere there's a hashtag in the correct response, just get rid of it. And then we go and combine that to write that out. Again, a vMix web API call that takes care of all that. So that's what we added into the vMix handler. So these two additional functions. And you can see these functions themselves are really fairly simple. They're not a lot of complexity here, but they just allow us now to call everything out in the logic. So before I get back to the next one, which is sort of our main quiz system interface, I just have another response. So we have Michael Quist came in. Michael, thank you. And I appreciate you, as always, taking a Friday night to spend time with us. So appreciate that, Michael. So let's jump over now to what we did in the quiz system. And there's a few things we've added here. So let me sort of slide up and see. Let me go to update scores, because that's probably where I'd like to start here. So one of the things we needed to be able to do was when we're keeping score, so when we close a round, we need to say, okay, let's take and update the scores based on all the responses we have. And so, as I mentioned, we're writing this file out to make sure we don't lose it. So we have a file path. We have a JSON object with all of the responses that came in. And then we have, well, what is the correct response? So we have to pass that in. And then what was the value of this question? Remember that point value that we can change for question to question or round to round, however we want to do that. So we put that in here. And so in this update the scores, we are passing that in, make sure there's values there. And then we're really just saying, well, let's initialize the score object to null. There's nothing there. And now we'll open the file. So that's the load JSON file. So we'll read in the score object. If it's there, we just load in those values and that's great. But if score object is null, if it isn't there, then we'll just initialize it to a null object. And basically, so there's nothing now in this object if it's the first time. Otherwise, we're just reading through and taking in all the old scores that we had previously. So let's see. So if we then want to take the score, we have this object which has all of our scores in it. And what we're doing is we're basically saying for each one of these responses, so for everybody that responded A, everybody that responded B, we're doing this big sort of outer enumeration. So we're enumerating all of those responses. And then for everybody that answered like A, we go through and do another enumeration here that says, okay, for each one of the people that answered for the first loop A, go back and say if they are, if there is no avatar, if we don't know this, if we have no way to index this person, just return and we'll just keep going. If we actually do have a response for that, but they're not in the score list, then we add them. So we turn around and say, okay, this is a new person who responded. They're not in anything I have in that object, so we're going to add them as a new person. And we basically add them as sort of a blank person, a person with score 0. We put their name and the avatar, if you remember those two fields that we had in there, and we set their score to 0. But if this score, like hash A or hash B or whatever, is the right answer, then what we need to do is we need to add, instead of just keeping that score as 0, we're going to turn around and say, for this person, add the points that are associated with this score. So this gives us a real easy way now to, as we loop through, take the responses for each one of the answers. If the answer was incorrect, and the person's there, we don't change the score. If it's incorrect and they're not there, we add them and set their score to 0. If it is the correct answer and they're there or not there, we take and add them or not and add the score to whatever score they have. So a fairly straightforward way to do this. And we don't have, a lot of new code logic in here. This is fairly straightforward JSON manipulation. Again, one of the beauties of Node.js for all of this. So that was the first thing that we have in here. The other thing, though, is we needed to make a few changes to what we were doing inside of the main loop. So let's go all the way to the bottom here and start to look at the main loop. A lot of this is identical. So all the stuff we did for initializing, nothing's changed since the last show on that. We have our big main loop. And if you remember, we use value 2 in vMix to control, which one of these which was the last question, and we use value 1, so the dynamic value 1, to say what function do we want. So that's all we're really doing here. So we're taking and pulling dynamic value 1, and again in the loop, based on whatever we set that for in vMix. That when I sort of create the state buttons on the bottom to control the flow, that's what I did, set the dynamic value. And this is just looping and pulling those dynamic values in. So like before, 1 still does I want to let people respond to my questions, and you get all those responses. Now, for once we close the question, that's basically where I start to have to tally and organize everybody that responded, put them into something. So we have to make a few changes in here. And what we ended up doing is we come here and say, well, let's update the scores now. So we have that function update scores that we had. we're basically turning around and saying, I've stored everybody in a valid response object. That was what we passed in. And now I go through that big loop. So all the scores are going to be updated here. So that's all we're doing. We've added this now as a way to pull that in. And we return something that's called scores. So this is that scores file that we had, that JSON file with everybody's score tallied up. And then returning that, we then actually go and we need to sort that. And the reason we're doing the sort is because we have a top 10 leaderboard. So we want to sort it so that the highest are at the top. And again, fairly simple. What we're doing is we're saying, take this JSON object scores and take all the values that are associated with this JSON object, and we sort them by high to low. And that's basically it. So you know, this is just a construct for this, but it basically lets me take all of those values and sort them in place. So in that object, I just turn around and it turns back a new object to me with everything sorted. And I just create that as sorted scores. So, you know, basically the same object, but just with everything sorted. And we hand that sorted scores object into update the leaderboard title. And so that's where we get the sorted scores and all the inputs, and that pushes it out. So that's all we needed to do. So when we now close the question, as opposed to simply having the list of who answered what, we now are doing all the score tallying too by just calling those two functions in this part of the loop. So again, very consistent with everything we've done to date. And then the last thing that we added that is different is we've added another function, value 4. So when dynamic value 1 equals 4, that's when we display that little checkbox. And so we just pull in the details about the current question and show the correct check. So whichever one of these is correct, we go and display that. And so that's all we're doing when we hit number 4. But everything else then works exactly as it did before. You can move questions, reset to clear the question, but it keeps the score. So you always have that score. And you know, that is just a JSON object and it's saved as a file. So if you ran a show this week and you wanted to carry on and have sort of a new tally board, but still have a running tally, you can use that data in your next show, and maybe write your own functions to say, well, I have my own score for today's show, but I also can use that old data and keep a running score and do things like that. Or you can use it for round to round. So if I have rounds, I want to load in new questions and start everything up for a new round, I can keep all the scores from the last round and have all that. And always, if something went wrong and your PC rebooted, you still are in perfect shape. It just goes and reads the file again. So that's really everything I wanted to cover here. And this hopefully closes the loop for everyone and gives you a good sense of the entire flow for how to build this quiz program and leverage it inside of vMix. And clearly, there's a lot you can do here to make it your own. But before we wrap up, let me just check on the comments here. So we have a few more. So we have Otis is saying hello. So Otis, thank you for joining us here. So Michael is commenting. He says, it looks like this would use all dynamic values in vMix that scripts can use. So yes, so the way we are handling this is inside of the function vMix handler. We have something that actually will take to read all of the dynamic values or to set any one of the individual dynamic values. So we have a function that does that. And so in vMix, because we are changing those, just through key presses, through shortcuts in vMix, when I'm in this Node.js running on a totally different system potentially, I can actually go into that vMix XML and pull that value out. And in that function to read the values, the dynamic value, by reading dynamic value 1, I know exactly where I am in terms of the questions, in terms of the functionality that I want to execute. And it lets me change them dynamically. So I could add new functions in this loop, this main loop that we had here. If I wanted to add 2 more different functions, like say I wanted to do last week's scores, I could add a dynamic value 5 and just do logic for that, and it will do what I want anytime you sort of add that extra functionality. And it's all controlled through vMix. So you don't need anybody interacting with the Node.js stuff on the Node.js console. You're doing all that interaction remotely across the network, and potentially on the same box, but typically on a different system across the network. Very easy to expand from that. So okay, no, I may be interpreting your question wrong here. So let me add another layer to this. So apologies for that. We use 2 of the dynamic values, 2 of the 4. In reality, you could make this more. You could use a single dynamic value, and you could write that as sort of an XML string or a JSON object that you sort of write in there, which I could read and then pull in, and you could do multiple things. It just takes more complicated scripting on the other side. The other thing is you could do things to just write this as a file. So if you wanted to pass this information through some sort of file passing, you could do that. There are other ways. I mean, you certainly could do things sort of through some sort of RESTful communication where it's just using sort of gets and puts. I would have to look exactly what I could get away with in vMix, but it is very possible that I would be able to, call something from vMix that just set a value somewhere else and make that happen. So different ways to do this. We were using the dynamic values. I'm using 2 of them to control this, but you could certainly in our current mechanism get it down to 1 and just sort of pack more information into that 1 value, or doing a separate mechanism, you could avoid using the dynamic values entirely and just sort of use other network constructs to communicate that information, or file share constructs to communicate that. So let's see. We have Bill. Bill just asked, can you export the scores at the end of the show into a CSV file? So the quick answer is yes. I mean, it's in a JSON file. So you actually have it in a structure that you can do something with. And it's a fairly easy to parse structure because it's all text. So converting that into a CSV file would not be terribly difficult. You'd basically be pulling each of these objects out and writing it out as a straight file. So that would be something you could do. Right now, we just write it out as a JSON file, but there's nothing special. That JSON file is really just a text file, as you can see, and very easy to parse because it's got all the limiters and everything in there. So something that wouldn't take a huge amount of logic. And there may be utilities that would do that, convert JSON to CSV. I haven't looked into that, but technically it's not a big step above what we have here already. So, all right. So I think that will be a wrap for our show today. If you have any other questions, get them ready. We'll, basically cover them in our post-show hangout. And I appreciate everybody's patience for this show. I know we were out last week, but it's definitely good to be back here now. If you are going to have the time, we'd love you to join us again next week. I believe on next week's show, what I want to take a look at is NDI 5.5. We have a few shows that we have planned coming up. So that was just rolled out this week. Some really cool and interesting stuff there. So we will cover that on next week's show. But if you can hang around for our post show, happy to answer any questions about it there as well. So if not, I'll see you next week. And if you can, I'll see you in a few minutes. Hello, welcome back to the post show. So you will excuse me if I have to take a drink of something. My throat is scratchy, so sorry about that. I just needed to get a little bit in me for this. So there was a few things that I missed, and I want to make sure we cover them here. So the Bill is saying that he's asking if we could do an episode for beginners showing how to run these scripts with vMix. That sounds like an actually a very good idea. So I will take that and see if we can get that scheduled. If not in August, maybe I think we might be able to get it into August. But that definitely makes sense to sort of do a very basic show about how we're working with some of this stuff. And so this is for clarity of vernacular. So we're all talking the same language here. The scripting language you're using is Node.js. Node.js is basically a JavaScript interpreter that runs under Windows or Mac, Linux, so lots of different platforms. So you can run JavaScript outside a browser. And one of the things it leverages is JSON, which is basically a JavaScript object notation. It's a way to describe data inside of JavaScript. And that's what we're doing. So the combination of JSON with Node.js is incredibly powerful. But Bill, I agree with you. It probably makes sense for us to cover this, and we'll try to slot that in a show this month. So thank you for pointing that out. That is a very good point to make. So let's see. So we have something. Are there any other? Yeah, okay. So Kyle was asking, could you have the value be variable based on the speed of the response? A higher score for quicker response. Kyle, I would love that. I mean, this is something we were talking about. Is there any way to do? The problem is we are getting these values fed into us from vMix Social. And there is no timestamp on when those values came in. So I have no way to sort of do competitive scoring where I can say, well, whoever answered first gets more and whoever answered second, something like that, which I know exactly what you're looking for. So this is something we were looking at. And I was actually going to, write an email to Tim and ask about if there was some way when you pull this information in, if there was some sort of timestamp that we could get from that. And I'd have to look. I'm not sure whether, Facebook and YouTube actually provide any sort of direct timestamp in the data they give to vMix Social. But if they did, that would be a great addition to here. So as I'm pulling this in, we'd get that. The only way that, so one other layer of indirection just for how we implemented this, because we don't have that data in the data itself, the only way we can pull this information in is by polling a title. So basically, we keep looking at this title. Let me jump over here and just show this, just because you can sort of see this going on. And let me see if I'll just cut this and see if we take the vMix output here. So this is us updating this title in the background. And so that's all we're doing here for pulling in, the guest. So we're seeing each guest that each viewer that responded and what their response was. And so we're pulling this in as a loop. I'm getting this through a loop that actually is happening normally in vMix Social. It comes back and says, loop through up to 200 of the last responses and just keep sending them in this many, times per second, or this many updates, over a 5-second period or something like that. And so that's exactly how this is coming into us. So we don't even know. We could be reading them totally out of order, because if somebody responded and they went on to the title and then the vMix Social put the next one on there, I don't know that. And I won't get them until vMix Social is looped through. So a couple of things, but I would love to do that. That is something, we're actually doing something with some of this code in Live to Air. And that is something that we do have some ability to do polling that we will be coming out with. And that is something that is in our polling where we have that timestamp for when the answers were given. So definitely something we'd love to see. So let's see. So does this kind of constant update not hit performance on the vMix function engine? So quick answer is no, because vMix is actually, vMix is writing these bits out to basically an XML file that's at a web URL. And our polling on that, I mean, we are polling this thing once a second, which in computer terms is really lightweight polling. And you're not actually asking vMix itself to do any real work. We are simply going to a place and reading from that. So there isn't any appreciable load on the vMix engine itself. The only pieces that will place load is when we ask vMix to do something specific, set a value, change title templates, do things like that. So for instance, when we paint in large numbers of users into a title where we're updating the title dynamically, there's probably more load, and that would raise vMix's processing load because it has to keep doing those updates. But those things are intermittent, so it's not a constant drain on vMix performance. And simply at this time, we're asking vMix to do something for us, and it'd be no different than us manipulating vMix directly to do this. So I think overall, this is a very, very efficient way to drive a lot of the things in vMix. Whereas if I were to do this in vMix scripting, this would put more of a load on vMix itself. I mean, vMix still has to do this as processing. And it appears that it's probably doing it all inside sort of the scope of vMix itself. So, that's why certain functionality isn't available inside vMix scripting that we do have, in more general external applications. So I think it is really safe from a performance point of view to be doing these types of things, and would really have pretty much a negligible impact on what you get to do with vMix directly. So let's see, what else do we have? So NDI 5.5, and explain a little about Bridge. So NDI 5.0 introduced Bridge, and what Bridge effectively lets you do is create a internet spanning connection between two systems that you can then pass NDI across. Now, those systems could be, in one building. They could be across the internet. So this is one of the big changes. Up until this point, NDI was really a local network protocol. And with NDI Bridge, you now have the ability to go across the internet. Two things that are important to keep in mind with this. The first is that NDI is pretty verbose. The data set that you're moving around is fairly large. So if I took a 1080 feed, like a 1080, 60 feed, a 1080 59.95, 94, that feed is going to take 140 megabits. So it's pretty big. If you transcode that into NDI HX, you're still probably talking about 15 megabits for sending that across the internet. So you have to have that 15 megabits of bandwidth or 150 megabits of bandwidth, whichever way you go, to send that out. NDI Bridge will transcode dynamically. So you can turn around and say, take this feed, transcode it into NDI HX, and then send that feed across. But that transcoding is really GPU intensive. I mean, you probably, I would guess they're using the GPU to do this, but it's processor intensive. It's compute intensive. So if you do that, every one of these feeds that you are transcoding into NDI HX from full NDI is going to suck up a lot of processing capability. So you would likely need to set up an external system that was a really beefy system, a lot of GPU, a lot of processing, to handle Bridge successfully. And so even though it is sort of a free addition, it does have a compute cost and a hardware cost associated with it to really use it in a practical, production framework where you need to have that box sort of managed and controlled, and know the limits of what you can send across based on both your bandwidth, the reliability of the network connection, and everything that you need to do transcoding wise. But what NDI Bridge and sort of that whole piece, the new NDI 5 adds to make this possible, is something called reliable UDP. And with reliable UDP, if a packet is lost, you have the ability to recover that, which means your signal over something like a wide area internet connection, if it has hiccups and sort of speed ups and slowdowns, that gives you a way to recover that and provide a higher quality video on the other side. So that's the other piece to that. I don't believe there's anything significantly changed in NDI 5.5, specifically with Bridge. I have reached out to some of the folks at NewTek, and hopefully I'll get more of the technical details underneath it. But they really, NDI 5 seems to be a sort of a cleanup and optimization for some of the stuff that was done in NDI 5, and an update to some of the tools that are there. So they've added some really nice features and added a new tool called NDI Router, which basically lets you bring in a bunch of NDI feeds and route them to different NDI outs. So pretty nice way to switch between different sources inside of a studio. So definitely cool stuff there. So let's see. So I think, let's see, what else do we have? So I think Michael was also asking about NDI Bridge compared to using SRT, which is another piece. They are very, very similar in sort of the technical basis. Different protocols. I mean, SRT and reliable UDP are basically both robust protocols for sort of marginal network environments where that connection could be intermittent in terms of quality and performance. So they are very, very similar. NDI Bridge really just lets you keep everything in the NDI world, and it wraps it as NDI. You're moving NDI across the wide area network. SRT is really just a wrapper for information. So what you'll typically do with SRT is you'll encode something and move that encoded file to the other side and just stream that encoded file out. And you add latency to it. So you turn around and say, in SRT, I could say, I need 200 milliseconds, and any data that may get dropped in that 200 millisecond window, you can still recover because it's holding it up on the other side to say, I'm waiting 200 milliseconds. So it's a way to sort of buffer that. But very, very similar, different use cases from different implementation cases, but the use cases are really pretty much identical. I need to send high quality video and audio across a wide area connection. So what other questions do we have here? So, oh yeah, so Kyle, I think once you start thinking about scripting and combine that with vMix or any other production tool, it opens up a whole new world. So this would be something where if vMix 26 added polling into it, this would be a great feature for a lot of people. And what scripting lets you do is sort of say, I don't necessarily have to depend on that coming in as a core feature. I can now add it. And as long as I have the means to drive the things inside of vMix to do what I want, that's a great way to do that. The other thing is there are people that are using hybrid production environments. So you can have things where people may be using a TriCaster to do a main switch, but vMix to do submixes and other types of functionality. I could be using vMix to do polling and do these types of quizzes and everything else, but be switching it on a TriCaster or switching it on OBS. So these types of things where you have generic scripting tools like Node.js, this allows you now to control a variety of systems. With everything I did here with this tool, I could take and basically rewrite some of the functions to do the same thing in OBS or do the same thing in TriCaster world. So I have this ability now by using something like Node to control multiple systems, multiple vMix systems or a mix of systems, TriCaster, OBS, and vMix, and to actually control that all from one place. So very, very cool stuff with scripting, and it opens up a lot of possibilities. So Bill is asking, he said that we've just seen Blackmagic come out with an SDI range of ATEM switches to match the HDMI ones. Do you see there being NDI ones in the future? That's a tough one. I am not sure that Blackmagic is on the NDI train yet. They haven't given any indication that that's something they are open to yet. But there are lots of NDI to SDI tools out there. So I think NewTek has tools which would take NDI signals and feed them out. You can read them in and feed them out SDI if you needed to do that. I believe there were other things that you could certainly do with external converters. So there's an interesting new device that's been on the verge of coming out for the last year, but I believe it's going to be coming out very shortly from BirdDog called the BirdDog Play, which is like $150 unit that will convert from NDI to HDMI. So if you had an older, ATEM with HDMI, for whatever that's $600, you'd be able to then take in NDI feeds and switch with that. So I don't expect this from Blackmagic in the immediate future. There may be enough market push to get them there in a later release, but I think for now this will probably have to be driven by external tools sit in that middle space between them. Like a lot of people are using converters right now to go from HDMI to SDI for things. So it'll be something similar, but for SDI to NDI. So what else do we have? Didn't rumors say that Blackmagic would make their own NDI? Blackmagic does have sort of their own IP stream. I don't live in the Blackmagic space, especially around here, as much as a lot of people. I believe they do, and it's something that they've had. Like they have a little device that will take and convert their signal to IP. I'm not exactly sure what's involved in that protocol, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But it is, as far as I know, sort of isolated into the Blackmagic universe. And I believe it's on some of their newest studio cameras, sort of their Studio 4K Pros, I think, have that attachment for that through the cat cable connection they have. But again, I'm not sure enough to talk. So that's actually something I will take a look at and see if I can come back with a better answer for you, Michael. So what else do we have? So, all right, I think we've probably covered everything. Hopefully this series was interesting to everyone, because sometimes it's hard to do things of substance within a single show. So I wanted to give this a try, really splitting something out that built off of one show after the other to make something that was more comprehensive than we could normally cover in a single show. So let me know what you think, because this is something I would definitely be interested in doing more of if it works for people. Otherwise, we may keep it for special occasions. So Bill has a question here. Says, have you looked at the Rode Streamcaster Pro 2 yet? I have not been able to get my hands on a copy of it. I would definitely love to. I've heard nothing but great things about it from people that I respect that have had time with it. So I think it is definitely, they took everything with the Rode Streamcaster, or was it their Procast? I forget exactly what it was. Their Procaster, Rode Procaster, maybe. I could be Podcaster. Sorry if I don't remember the name exactly. But they took everything with the first generation of that, and they really sort of turned it up to 11. They took all the things that people liked and cleaned them up and really streamlined the way the interface works. And so I think it is definitely a great step forward. And I know a lot of people are using it as their main mixer. It's just that good. But it is something that I have not worked with hands-on, so I don't want to give you a personal recommendation other than to say I've heard lots of great things from people I really respect about it. And, everything I've seen would make me inclined to say that would probably be worth your time, looking at. So, Node.js it's going to take time for anybody getting started to really learn more about it. But like I've mentioned in the past episodes, there are incredibly good tutorials on YouTube. So just go in there and say Node.js tutorials under YouTube, and you'll get probably 4 or 5 really comprehensive, well-produced tutorials on how to get started with Node.js. And I mean, to Bill's point also, I think this would be something that's worthwhile for us to probably do, to sort of just do a quick jump start and point you to some of the resources we found most useful in that. So, as we do more with Node in the future, it'll be easier for everybody to sort of pick that up and run with it. But definitely a lot of stuff with this. And the fact it can work so well with vMix means that it opens up a whole new realm of possibility for this. And creating libraries, like we said, where you can put all the functionality you want to call in vMix into these libraries, that will hide everything from you then. So you could effectively write the logic, call these library calls, and over time, the work for adding new functionality in Node will become pretty small. We're basically just running through logic, but calling all these functions you've already built in a vMix library. So definitely a lot there for going forward. So I'm glad you find this helpful, Michael. So do we have anything else yet? All right, I think we're probably about ready then to wrap this up. So thank you everyone for spending time in the post-show hangout. I really enjoy this part of the show every bit as much as the shows themselves. So I'm glad you were able to make time to be here. So we will see you all again next Friday, same time, same channel. Take care, everyone, and thanks for watching.